Kull felt vaguely angered at two. "At least two," said he. "The cat talks. That you cannot deny." "There is some trickery," two stubbornly maintained. "Man talks. Beasts may not." "Not so," said Kull himself, convinced of the reality of the talking cat and anxious to prove the rightness of his belief. "A lion talked to Canberra, and birds have spoken to the old men of the Sea Mountain tribes, telling them where game was hidden. None denies that beasts talk among themselves. Many a night have I lain on the slopes of the forest-covered hills, or out on the grassy savannas, and heard the tigers roaring to one another across the starlight. Then why should some beasts not learn the speech of man? There have been times when I could almost understand the roaring of the tigers. The tiger is my totem, and is taboo to me save in self-defense," he added irrelevantly. Two squirmed. This talk of totem and taboo was good enough in a savage chief, but to hear such remarks from the king of Valusia irked him extremely. "My lord," said he, "a cat is not a tiger." "Very true," said Kull, "and this one is wiser than all the tigers." That is from The Cat in the Skull, a story that you can find in this volume. This is Kull, Exile of Atlantis. Welcome, my friends, welcome once again to Stately Von Manor and the Robert E. Howard Show. Yes, it is the Robert E. Howard Show once again, and we're going to continue talking about Kull. We're getting to an interesting point in the Kull series, because at this point we're getting to a bunch of stuff that was never published in Robert E. Howard's lifetime. So we've already talked about the Shadow Kingdom, which is one of Robert E. Howard's greatest stories, and definitely the greatest Kull story. We've talked about the Mirrors of Tuzan Thun, which was excellent. Now, after those two stories in this book, we get to a part where it's just titled Untitled Draft. So we've got an Untitled Draft which is about Kull getting really pissed off at this guy, and this guy runs off with this woman, and Kull's following him with a bunch of warriors because he's so pissed off. And he travels through a bunch of different countries in his world, which is interesting because we never get to see those countries in the other Kull stories. We got some great artwork here by Justin Sweet. But right when this story is getting really good, and it is getting really good, it ends. And we don't know how this story is going to end because it was never published, it was never finished. Next we get to The Cat and the Skull, which could be the worst Robert E. Howard story ever told. I don't know that it is, and there are parts of it that aren't bad. Here's the thing. We're getting into a series of stories now that, like I said, were never published. So if you're just reading them along in this book and you don't know the story behind the stories, this part of the book reads really oddly. Now, with Solomon Kane and the Savage Tales of Solomon Kane that we already talked about, we have a collection of stories that move right along in a linear fashion. They're internally consistent. The character of Solomon Kane develops throughout the stories, has a satisfying conclusion. As a book, The Savage Tales of Solomon Kane really works. This does not. And the reason is because you've got some stories that were finished, that were published, that were done. And in the middle of all that, you have a bunch of stuff that was never finished, that was never published, that was never meant to be seen by anybody. And now it's all in the middle of this book, and we're all reading it as part of the Kull saga. And it really doesn't work. For one thing, you'll notice strange peculiarities, like the fact in all of these stories in the middle of this volume, you have these two young lovers who cannot be together for whatever reason. Maybe it's this woman's father won't let them be together. Maybe they're two social classes and they can't be together because of the law. Their only hope to be together is to appeal to Kull, but Kull can't let them be together because of the law or some reason, whatever it is. But by the end of the story, he will, use his influence or his power to let them be together. This happens over and over again. And the stories in the middle of this, one story after another, has this same thing going on. Also, you'll notice that in different stories, you have characters with the same names, but they're clearly different people. So what the hell is going on? Well, what was going on is that one story after another either was rejected by Weird Tales, or Robert E. Howard just decided that this story isn't working, and he's moving on to another story. And since this last story, no one's ever going to see it, right? He can use whatever elements he wanted to continue to work on in this next story to see if it would work. And this next story doesn't work and is either rejected or just doesn't work, so he moves on to this next story. He's trying to work stuff out. He's trying to work out different things in this series and trying to get them down and just seeing if these elements will work in a story. And so he will use the same elements over and over again. He feels free to use character names that he likes over and over again because these last couple stories, no one's ever going to see them. Ever. They'll never see those stories. Well, we see those stories because they're all in here. And so it makes sense why the young lovers keep popping up over and over again. It makes sense why some stuff in these stories just doesn't work. Because it didn't work, and he abandoned them, or they were rejected, and he just let them go and never continued to work on them. And so it's no real surprise that The Cat in the Skull is kind of a terrible story. Now, there's some stuff in The Cat in the Skull that does work. Basically, what The Cat in the Skull is about, we have this beautiful young woman, rendered wonderfully by Justin Sweet. And she's got a cat. And she convinces King Kull that this cat is an immortal cat that can talk and is very wise and has all this knowledge. And that, Kull, you really ought to listen to this cat. Why is she doing this? Because obviously the cat can't talk, right? It's a cat. Now behind the cat, there's always this slave who's standing there. And he's got like this mask covering his face. Oh, how about that? Obviously we know what's going on, right? Kull doesn't. Kull comes off as a complete dope in The Cat in the Skull. I mean, he comes off dumb as a rock, which is the main problem of this story. That's the main problem. The story has other problems. But the main problem is that Kull just looks like a complete idiot. Now, we've seen from the previous Kull stories that he might not be the brightest bulb in the pack, but he's never seemed so dim as he does in this story. He's a dope in this one, and that's one of the things that doesn't work. I think Robert E. Howard was kind of comfortable with having Kull not be super bright, but he realized that doesn't work. He realized that because everything he learned in this series, that everything he felt worked and everything that he learned didn't work, he used in the future when he created the Conan stories in the Hyborian Age. That series works. That is a series of stories that is excellent, that is remarkably internally consistent, even though all the stories happen at different times in Conan's life. And that the elements of the stories work really, really well. I mean, that was an excellent series of stories. One of the reasons is because all the stuff that didn't work, he worked out here. And it's all on full display. I mean, some of the stuff that he never touched again, like the young lovers, well, he did, but whenever he did come back to that kind of theme, he came back to it differently and in a more mature fashion, and used that kind of thing in a different way. In this series of stories, of course, the young woman who's using the cat wants to be with a man that she can't be with, and if she wants to use the cat to convince Kull that they should be together, and it's just lame. At one point, the cat convinces Kull that Brule the Spear Slayer, his best friend, who has gone for some reason to this forbidden lake that happens to be full of monsters, is in trouble, and that he needs to go save Brule right now. So he's like, oh well, if the cat says it, I bet it must be true. And so he rushes out to this lake. No sign of Brule. So if Brule was here menaced by monsters, he's probably dragged under the water by now and drowned, because it must have taken some time to get from the castle to this lake. But, you know, Kull dives in the water and fights a bunch of monsters one after another. There is an interesting sequence when he meets some magical beings at the bottom of the lake that live in their own other world down there. That's an interesting little sequence. Probably should have been in a better story. By the end of this story, we run across an interesting character, a wizard called Folsa Doom, whose name you will remember from the first Conan the Barbarian movie. No other relation between these two characters, just a cool name. This is a wizard with a skull's head. So he basically looks kind of Skeletor-like. Interesting concept. And again, Robert E. Howard used this idea later on. But it didn't work in this story. You have these different elements that are all sandwiched together in this one story. And none of them really work. The writing goes from being serviceable to not very good to really good, depending on which section and how into it I think Robert E. Howard was. Clearly this stuff in the middle of this book, a lot of these stories just were not meant to see the light of day. And The Cat and the Skull is just not very good. But because it is one of the few things he wrote about Kull, you can read it. It was first published in 1967 in the first paperback edition of Kull, the Lancer edition. I believe it was 67. There was the Lancer edition of King Kull that came out, and a bunch of these stories, that's the first time they ever saw the light of day, was in that paperback. And they've been available since that time. And yeah, so if you know the history of those stories, they work a good deal better. There are some stories from that period that work better than others. There's the Screaming Skull of Silence, which is just okay. There is the Striking of the Gong, which is just okay. Probably the best of there's a couple good ones. There's Swords of the Purple Kingdom, which works as a story. That's pretty good. And By This Axe I Rule, which is interesting. There are things that really work in that story, but that story was taken and was transformed into a Conan story called The Phoenix on the Sword, which turned out to be the first Conan story. Everything that didn't work in that version of the story, Robert E. Howard made work in The Phoenix on the Sword. And that, I think, is going to be the next story we talk about, is going to be By This Axe I Rule, because that story has some great stuff in it. And Kull certainly comes off much better in that story. In this story, The Cat and the Skull, not so much. Now, eventually they figure out the cat's just a cat and all of that. But it's one of those stories that it probably would have been just fine if it had never seen the light of day and we had not been forced to read it. Instead, we have read it. It's been adapted into Marvel Comics because it's one of the few Kull stories. I mean, it will live forever now because it's a Kull story. But that is one of the important things to note about the middle section of this book. All of that stuff was never supposed to be seen by anybody. And so all the weirdness that you see in those stories, all the character names that come back over and over again, all the goofy young lovers, that's why that's all there. And I don't blame Robert E. Howard for this bad story, because he was obviously working this stuff out. And I'm glad he worked it out. because his later work, his Conan stuff, which came right from this is the genesis of that. That stuff was amazing. So anyway, that's the Robert E. Howard story for that's the Robert E. Howard show for today. Catch me next week when we talk about By This Axe I Rule, where we go further on into the Kull series and then head on towards the end of the Kull series. And then, of course, we're moving on to Bran Mak Morn, King of the Picts. All right, guys, I will catch you next time.